Most of you know something about CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Maybe you went through a course, Red Cross, or with Red Cross, or something like that in high school, or certainly you would have seen something like this in a Hollywood movie. Somebody has a cardiac arrest. Somebody with the right cinematic look steps in, presses down on the chest, breathes into their mouth, and there are a few tense moments, after which the victim suddenly starts breathing, coughs, gives a weak smile, and somebody cracks a joke, and then there are hugs and high fives, and everybody is happy. The reality, unfortunately, is a lot different, as I'll explain. It's estimated that more than 1 million CPRs are performed every year. CPR is indeed a life-saving technique that's useful, potentially, in situations where the heartbeat or breathing has stopped. So CPR is intended to keep the blood flowing so that every cell in the body continues to get the oxygen it needs. And in particular, the objective is to keep critical organs like the brain and the heart alive. The question that we are really asking is, what is the effectiveness of CPR? So the first question is, how long do you do CPR, right? So you do CPR with the intent that the body can take over. And that point, we say that we have achieved what is called return of spontaneous circulation, or ROSC for short, ROSC. So the idea is we want to keep doing this until the body recovers. The question that we are asking is, how effective is CPR in being able to do this? So CPR can be performed in various locations. For example, it can be done in a hospital by qualified people with high-quality equipment, or it can be done out of a hospital, as shown on the slide, maybe by the roadside, by trained or untrained personnel in what is called a bystander CPR. So I want you to guess what you think the survival numbers are for both of these cases. Let's say in the hospital. What do you think the survival numbers might be? 85, 90%, 70. Okay, so we have somebody a little pessimistic here. So let's say 70 to 90%, so maybe like 80%. So how about a bystander CPR? So maybe you or I will do the CPR. Then what happens? 30%, okay. 60. So, maybe 50% is what I think people are leaning towards. Well, thank you very much for those responses. I have some cold hard statistics. It turns out that the survival numbers are a dismal 2 to 15% in, although it could be higher, maybe like as high as 30% when performed by top-notch doctors in an excellent hospital with all kinds of equipment that they have at their behest. So the question that we have now is, why? Why are these survival, I'm sure that you are surprised by these numbers, so why are the survival numbers so low? The answers are quite complex, as we'll see. So currently, CPR consists of 4 phases, and I'll only focus on 2 of the phases, which are compression and ventilation, which are the key areas where a lot of decisions have to be made. These procedures are performed according to guidelines issued by the American Heart Association, or AHA, and these are standardized, relatively one-size-fits-all guidelines. So based on our research that we've done over 15 years in collaboration with medical researchers, we now know for sure that CPR should not ideally be done using one-size-fits-all guidelines. It should really be personalized to the person's size, gender, maybe physiological markers, and as well as etiology, or the original cause of cardiac arrest. It should also be optimized to maximize the blood flow and the gas uptake levels for all the critical organs so they can stay alive. So It turns out that neither personalization nor optimization is possible today in the current scenario, even in the best possible situations, primarily because we just don't know what's going on. We have a lot of ignorance about this, and it's high time we fix this. So let's dig a little deeper and see what really happens when you do CPR. So when a person presses down, a provider presses down on the chest, we all understand that what they're really doing is delivering a force. And the current guidelines from AHA says that you have to do this at about 100 beats a minute. And what you see on the slide is basically a actual real recorded CPR force for an individual who was going through CPR, which is about 100 beats a minute. And very appropriately, this is the beat of the famous Bee Gees song, Staying Alive. It goes, staying alive, right? And I'm a compassionate person. Before you panic, so I'll stay away from singing, and I'll come back to the science. I'm not going to inflict on you that. So now what happens when you apply a force? When you apply a force to the chest, the heart starts beating, and blood starts flowing through the arteries, and it gets to the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then the oxygenated blood gets to all the critical organs, hopefully keeping everything alive. And this goes round and round, and hopefully until, ROSC happens, right? So that's a bit of magic. So we are hoping that as you continue to do this, suddenly the heart starts beating by itself, and then the provider can take their hands off and let the body do its thing. The problem is, it doesn't happen, right? The ROSC doesn't always happen. So the question is, why? Why is it that it happens sometimes and doesn't happen sometimes? So the answer to this, unfortunately, is that we don't really know. And we really need to fix this ignorance. So let me go through the things that we know and we don't know. The first question is, how does CPR work? So when you press down on the chest, we know blood starts flowing. How? So there are two theories about this. One called the cardiac pump theory, another one is called a thoracic pump theory. In the cardiac pump theory, basically says, look, if you press down on the chest, you're actually pressing down on the chambers of the heart, which gets the heart beating, and the blood gets out into the aorta, or the main systemic artery, and eventually gets through the rest of the body. The thoracic pump theory says, on the other hand, that when you press down on the chest, you increase the pressure in the thoracic cavity, getting the blood out of the thorax into the system through the heart, effectively treating the heart more as a conduit or a passive pipe. So I know this is complicated, but I'm just telling you this to indicate that, to give you a sense of how fuzzy our understanding is, even the simple mechanism of why the blood starts flowing in the first place when you do CPR. Now, it doesn't end there. In fact, there are a ton of other questions. So, for example, I told you CPR should be done at 100 beats a minute. Why 100? Should it be the same for every kind of individual and every kind of physical situation, medical situation? Should it vary as we go along, depending on the physiological markers you're looking at? Talking about physiological markers, what should you be measuring when you're doing this? Should you be measuring the blood pressure in the arteries? Maybe the blood flow to the heart and the brain. Maybe the heartbeat, oxygen saturation. It turns out that as you continue to do CPR, the chest cavity changes its properties. So should you change CPR as you go along? What should be the compression depth be? Should it vary depending on the condition, depending on the patient, depending on the size of the individual? And in a hospital, we often use a ventilator to supply air. So what should be the optimal ventilator settings? And of course, you have the opportunity to maybe inject a drug like epinephrine. What should be the appropriate dosage for this patient? We don't really know any of these questions. So we've been working on this, trying to answer some of these questions over, like I said, over 15 years. And by we, I mean a collaboration between my research team consisting of some marvelous students and postdocs working with an excellent critical care department at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, or CHOP. CHOP leads several research consortia around the country and the globe in critical care, and has amassed arguably the world's largest and best CPR data, which we have access to. So in addition to the data, of course, we have access to some of the very high-quality critical care expertise. So when I talk about all the research we're doing, we refers to this collaborative, very fruitful collaboration between engineers and doctors. And in addition, of course, most of this research has been supported by National Institutes of Health. So let me share, of the many different problems we've done, let me share one very exciting problem that this collaboration has worked on. So first, there is a problem that I want to define. So when you do CPR, the providers are hoping that the heart will start beating by itself, because that's when you can stop, right? So the question is, how do you know the heart is beginning to beat by itself? So what you have to do, of course, is you continue to do CPR until the heart beats, and then you have to take your hands off, right? So this is the objective. Well, research has shown that the longer you do CPR, the lower the survival, or perhaps survival with bad neurological outcomes. So you want to minimize the length of CPR. However, obviously, you don't want to give up too early, because if you did that, clearly you're giving up on the body, and the body, just dies, right? So too short, and the body just never recovers, and too long, and you create either no survival or a survival with poor neurological outcomes. So there is an optimum Goldilocks kind of a period of time when you should do CPR. The problem is we don't know what that should be. In fact, it's very likely that it's different for different patients and different physiological conditions. So the provider doesn't know offhand what they should be. So what do? They start doing CPR for a few minutes. They stop to check to see if the heart is beginning to beat. If the heartbeat is strong enough and seems to sustain, hooray, the patient lived. And you can walk away, and everything is fine, right? But if not, they'll go right back in and perform CPR again. So here's the problem. More research has shown that this stopping and checking is also very inimical, very, very hazardous to the body. And very often the patient doesn't survive if you do too much of this. So what we really need is a way to tell if a native heartbeat is present while the CPR is being performed without stopping CPR. Okay? This is tricky and has never been done before. Well, here is some breaking news, because hot off the press, based on our research that we've done over the last 3 or 4 years, we now have developed an algorithm that monitors all these variables, and while CPR is being performed, can tell with reasonable certainty that there is a native heartbeat, if there is one, so with something like 80 to 90% accuracy. So we are totally excited about this, because what this means is that the providers can just continue to do CPR, and then until our algorithm tells them to stop, and then the provider can take their hands off and let the body do its magic. So we're really excited about this, and we think we are on the verge of a revolution in improving survival numbers. So this is great. I think I shared with you one of our research results, which can be very impactful once it makes its way to the patient's bedside after further testing and so on. So this is great, don't get me wrong. However, we still continue to have a lot of questions unanswered. And as the saying goes, there are miles to go before the research can sleep. So the problem is, all these questions I raised earlier remain unanswered. And there's a lot of ignorance in spite of so many years of research by us and as well as many other researchers around the world. And considering that CPR is such a common procedure, and millions of CPRs are performed every year, and so many people's lives are at stake, it's high time we upped the game and started essentially what I would call a revolution. So, in my opinion, there are 4 things we can do, or we should be doing. The first is modeling. So what I mean by modeling is that we should be using physics, physiology in addition to signal processing and modern tools like artificial intelligence, to understand the fundamentals of really the underlying mechanisms of what makes it the CPR. What does CPR do to the human body? We really need to understand this from the inside. Modeling is something medicine has largely shied away from, and I think it's high time we fix that. And as I've been talking about, we need to develop personalized and optimized CPR for every individual and for every condition and every physiological marker. This again requires modeling as well as data that we have access to. Thirdly, we need to automate where the CPR is actually delivered by robotic tools, because everything physical human beings can do, machines can do better, faster, more accurately, and with better repeatability and more robustly. In fact, robotic tools will help us do things in a feedback loop, which human beings have trouble doing. Again, this requires better understanding and better technology. And the fourth point is a very important point that's not technological, but rather more sociological. This is, very close to my heart. And if you think about a lot of the critical care services, like CPR, they're not delivered uniformly across the globe, and not even in the United States. We continue to make tremendous advances in medicine and technology. The newspapers are full of this every day. But we still haven't made a dent in the unevenness and the inequity of its delivery. Very few people on the planet, in fact, have access to the life-saving medical technology that we are inventing. Even in the United States, the quality of care and the effectiveness varies tremendously across rural, urban, and suburban landscapes. As we continue to make these exciting discoveries and invent new technology, we need to, in fact, it's an obligation for us to develop this technology along with ways and means to universalize the impact of this exciting research. So, in a small way, on this revolution, we have started a laboratory 2 years ago called Novamed at Villanova University, dedicated to developing affordable, affordable but high quality medical care for the needier parts of the world. So, in summary, in my opinion, if we follow the steps that I outlined, we will achieve our overarching vision of a highly effective, accurate, universally available, affordable CPR technology, and eventually that's automated, that will increase survival numbers wherever it's performed, saving millions of lives that are being lost today unnecessarily. So but I want to assure you that in the meantime, when you're waiting for all this research to happen, if you are in a situation where CPR is needed, if you're trained, I urge you to do what you can, because CPR does save lives today. And I've convinced you of my vision, of the need to make these changes, I urge you to contribute your time, your expertise, your advocacy, and perhaps funds to support all of these initiatives wherever you may do it, and join in this voyage. Thank you.